Bastienne Schmidt, who is a multimedia artist working in photography, painting, and large-scale drawings. Being the daughter of an archaeologist influenced her creative process and instilled a desire to organize and understand systems through her artwork. Inspired by ancient Greek ceramics, Japanese woodcuts, fairy tales, and American pop culture, what an interesting combination. Her work often incorporates and transforms archetypal shapes. Bastienne's work is included in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, the International Center of Photography, Brooklyn Museum, Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., here at the Parrish Art Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She was born in Germany and raised in Greece and Italy, and she now lives in New York and East Hampton. Please welcome Bastienne Schmidt.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Corinne, for a beautiful exhibition. Thank you to the fellow artists, Janet and Priscilla, and thank you for Valerie for choosing us. And thank you, Terry and the Parish. It's a wonderful opportunity. So I'm going to set the stage and show a little bit of the place where I came from and how it influenced the work that I'm doing right now. So as Corinne mentioned, I grew up in Greece, and my formative years were spent on an island called Samos. We moved to Greece when I was 9, and my father was an archaeologist, and we spent 3 months out of the year on this island. I bought a little place there 25 years ago, and this place has become also my stage. I create there, I photograph there, I collect there, and it's part of my being, my inner being, really. So this is actually part of a self-portrait series, which I started with home stills and have been continuing over 20 years. I collect also old photographs, as you can see in the house, because I'm really interested how people remember each other in different stages of their lives. So the piece to the left is actually based on an old vintage photograph of my father that he photographed shards of terracotta on a table in a museum in Samos. And for me, this was the way I observed him and our life. He would kind of sort through things. He would work on archaic terracotta, and he would lay it out on these kind of flat Greek cigarette boxes. And he had an amazing memory to kind of reconnect pieces that might fit like two pieces of a puzzle. When I was a child, obviously, I was not particularly interested in the way my father was working and what he was doing, but I observed him keenly. And now, in retrospect, only I really discover how much it has influenced my way of creating. What I love to do is I love to line things up. I love to create with grids, and I love to create a slightly off chance so it's not a clean geometry, but a soft geometry where it's like something off kilter. So I describe my process combining really the Greek side of my upbringing with my German side, because I was born originally in Germany, and I grew up with German fairy tales. I love the work of the Bechers, the typology of the water towers. They photographed as a couple their whole life long water towers, and these water towers look slightly different one to another, and there's a joy in really observing the sameness and the difference. So on the right side, you see a photograph of my project Home Stills. What I did over a number of years, I photographed myself in the home, but also objects that I used in the home. It's sort of a domestic DNA project. So I collected these soaps over a period of 4 or 5 years. And the idea was it became like a Zen object that was touched by the daily use and was left over in the end. And then I just laid them out on a tablecloth, which reminded me of my Greek neighbors, and kind of documented it. For me, it's a documentation of the process of not being anymore, of disappearing. So this is one of my earlier examples of my grid project. The very first version of it was on paper. It was a grid of 8 by 8 inches. There were punched holes on a 16 by 20 sheet arches paper. And somehow I became really interested in this idea, like a riddle, like a Zen exercise. How many different variations could I come up with if I kind of inserted something into the grid and left some of the spaces open? How many different geometries could I come up with? Then the next step was, I said, I want to go bigger because paper is very fragile, and if you go too big, it becomes complicated. So then I thought, well, maybe I could use fabric, cotton canvas. That's also a kind of a fabric that's used very much in Greece. and I love to work with humble materials that I find in Greece. And I thought, well, I could kind of sew a grid, so I have like this idea of a geometry, but also sewn lines that are soft, because when you sew something and then you stretch it, you never have a totally precise line. And that became my yin and yang. The geometry on one hand was the German side, and on the other side was the Greek side, the soft geometry. Then I started inserting things into these sewn canvases. So I collected pumpkin seeds from our own garden, but then I also went into the store to King Cullen and bought Chinese imported pumpkin seeds. So it became this play-off between the natural world around us, but also the imported world and what is in between. This is also still part of the first white grid series. I used tracing paper with muslin fabric and then sewed it together and stitched it onto the canvas. Again, it's like the playing with the softness of the lines and the grid itself. And the grid is a fascinating thing. I think we all are surrounded by grids all the time. I mean, I relate to it in terms of Bauhaus architecture or Annie Albers and her work. So there is like this attraction to it, but of course a grid can be also off-putting, because if it's too constructed, if it's too harsh, the eye goes over it too quickly. That was another grid that I sewed. What I did, I pleated each individual line, and then I inserted in each little rectangle a twig that I found in the garden. So this is a bigger piece, 48 by 48 inches. So the work that you're seeing now is actually only work from the last 3-4 years. But somehow this obsession with the grid, I think, is here to stay for the next few years, because it's a very giving thing. That's another version of a grid where I only sewed the edges, and the inside, they were just pleated and ironed. It reminds me also of Lucio Fontana and Latin American artists, which I love. There's an excellent show at the Museum of Modern Art right now entitled Sur Moderno, which was donated by Patricia Cisneros. And there were a lot of artists who had a reference point to Europe initially, but they had like a much softer interpretation of what art dealing with geometry can be. So there are artists such as Gego, there are artists such as Lydia Clark, Lydia Pape, and they're wonderful. And so Lucio Fontana, what interests me about him, this idea that he interfered into the canvas or so. So it was, the gesture itself was not a painted gesture, but it was a gesture which was done through a slashing of the canvas, and then the canvas itself became a sculptural object. So after quite a while, when I worked just with white on white, I decided to introduce one color. So that's a thing also with a grid. You can change the rules, and the minute you change the rules, you have a new possibility, and then you kind of stretch out that possibility. So blue for me is a significant color, because I was surrounded by blue in Greece my whole life. And I created these kind of ideas of shades of blue. So what I would do, I would work with pure pigment. I would tint different pieces of canvas, and then cut them out and sew them into it. So this piece is called basically the shades of blue of Greece that I remember. Then the next step was, what else can the blue do or so? I did a whole series just with horizon lines, because they reminded me of the Greek horizon. But then I started cutting them up in different pieces. Another artist that is very dear to my heart is Matisse, and especially the papier collé. The idea that you just use a painted material as a collage like that you can move around and construct your own inner space is very appealing to me. And also in Japanese art, what is really interesting with the woodcut prints, they do nothing else than really work with this very defined, delineated spaces. So after going to see a show at the Guggenheim Museum, which was a show of Annie and Joseph Albers going to Mexico, which was very influential for them. So to combine the context of this idea of textiles and weaving and seeing Mexican archaeology kind of made me think of these combinations. Another interesting thing is when you work on a series like that, while you work on it, you think also. So during that process, it breeds like new ideas. So usually when I'm done with a piece, I have an idea for a new piece. And I always work with sketches, but then there's also the moment, even if you have a sketch and you think you know exactly what you're doing, something could shift slightly. And also you can make errors, but the arrows becomes a part of the next piece. Then after a while, having investigated only the white and the blue, I decided to enter another color, which was red. And in my other works, I use a lot of times these kind of very strong colors. So for me, the white works really well with the blue and the red. And also the slight shift of the line. If you see the top piece and the bottom piece, there's a slight shift to the right. And I like this idea, this kind of imprecision that makes not just the line waver, but kind of creates like an irritation to the eye. That's another piece where I used only the square and orange-red, which goes back to my series. I did a book a few years ago called Typology of Women, where I painted orange paper, really big sheets, and then cut them out and created these silhouettes of different women's models. So it's, again, just like the cutout shape and the piece itself. When you also work with sewing, you only can think in geometries. Of course, you can sew something round, but it's much, much more complicated, and it's not apparent. I mean, that's another reason why I like any elbows or so, because when you weave, you think continuously in the concept of horizontal and vertical. It becomes like your native language. So once I started working this way, I also discovered that I was creating these kind of calligraphies or this kind of alphabet that's not really an alphabet, but maybe ask you, is it a letter? What does it mean? Another way of breaking out of the idea, is it painting, a textile, a thing? When I started working on these big sheets of pigmented fabric, I started cutting them up and kind of incorporate them into a real physical grid where you see the undulation. And then I painted these extra strips that I sewed into it. And I like this idea of this in-between space of a thing. This was part of an earlier project. I did a whole series of mind maps. So the idea was we're always trying to find the place to orient ourselves. Where are we from? Where do we belong? Where do we stand? So I created these imaginary maps, and a bunch of them were based on the concept of the Whaling Museum in Sag Harbor, where I did actually the Parrish Roadshow quite a few years ago. And so netting and grids were something that united actually men and women in those days, because the men were actually very involved sailors. They had to fix their own nets or so. And a net is a grid in a certain way. But also on the other hand, like when you have a map itself, a map is also a grid, because to see where you are in space, you need a map. So these were drawn maps where I used also a lot of tracing paper and collage materials. These are also two works on canvas. And as I was saying, with these hidden geometries and also alphabets, when I started making them, initially I was not aware that it could be also read as something. But then I looked again at Christopher Wool and kind of made me think of these kind of subversive messages that can be somewhere, even if you don't reveal it. That's also a very recent piece. So what I did there, I incorporated the grid that I pleated and sewed. And then I created these fabric sleeves. They have like this fabric that I feel very close to when I was growing up in Greece. The Greek ladies, they always had this kind of patterned fabric for their bags or for their house coats or in the tablecloths. So it's also part of my working that I integrate that in some way, shape or form. So on one hand, my work is very graphic and clear, but then there's also a sense of whimsy or so that's part of that. That's also one of my very recent pieces. It's a very minimalist piece, but the different pieces are hand-painted and then sewn together. So it looks like a very sharp geometry, but it's kind of sewn together. So one part of the series was sewn with heavy cotton cloth, and then I started working with this thinner muslin fabric. The nice thing about it, had kind of a sheen. It was like a softer material, soft to the touch. And I always ironed it from the back, but when you had these kind of fraying lines on the back, you could see a slight imprint on the front. And then I thought, well, that's really interesting. It's kind of like a shadow line or something that the piece lifts from it too. And some people ask me, how do you see your work? Is it a painting or is it a quilting? And for me, in the end of the day, there's really not a distinction. Material is a choice that we make for a particular paradigm that we create in our minds. So I see it's for me, it's the same. It's a painting, it's a textile, it's a being, it's something in space. It's an imaginary space that I create to kind of validate my thoughts. This is one of the pieces that in the exhibition. And again, the way I worked, I do initially sketches, and then I sew it, but then I also look at it again, and sometimes I remake something because I don't like the drift, and sometimes I'm also surprised because sometimes by mistake you sew together two pieces that are not supposed to go together, but then you like them. So a part of my fabrics are pigmented and some are not, so it's like this going back and forth of painting and sewing. That's also another big piece that's in the exhibition. And this is also the last piece, which is in the exhibition. Well, I think that's it. Thank you for listening.